The sun bled crimson across the western horizon, painting the vast expanse of sage and rock in shades of fire and shadow. A dry wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 untold stories and the mournful cry of a lone coyote somewhere in the distant hills. This was the frontier, a land where civilization's reach grew thin and men learned to live with loneliness as their most faithful companion. Jed Carter stood on the porch of his ranch house, weathered hands gripping a cup of bitter coffee as he watched another day die. The wooden boards beneath his boots creaked with age, echoing the weariness in his bones. At 35, he had the eyes of a man who'd seen too much, gray as winter storm clouds and just as cold. His ranch sprawled before him, 500 acres of stubborn grassland and rocky outcrops that he'd wrestled into submission through sheer force of will and countless dawn-to-dusk days. The house behind him stood empty save for his presence. No woman's touch softened its rough edges. No children's laughter brightened its rooms. Just silence, thick and heavy as a wool blanket. Jed preferred it that way, or so he told himself every night when the walls seemed to press in closer than the day before. It had been 7 years since the Comanche raid that took his family. 7 years since he'd returned from a cattle drive to find his parents' homestead reduced to charred timber and ash, their bodies buried hastily by neighbors who'd come too late. His younger sister Sarah, just 16, was never found. The memory still clawed at him in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep refused to come and the past felt more real than the present. He'd rebuilt here, 20 miles from that cursed ground, far enough from town that visitors were rare and questions even rarer. The nearest neighbor was old Tom Mackenzie, and he lived a good hour's ride to the north. Jed made the trip to Clearwater once a month for supplies, speaking only what was necessary, conducting his business with the efficiency of a man who'd learned that words were just another currency better saved than spent. The November air carried a bite that promised winter's approach. Jed drained the last of his coffee and turned to head inside when something made him pause. The horses in the corral had lifted their heads, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. His hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 holstered at his hip, a gesture born of survival in a land where danger wore many faces. But the horses settled after a moment, returning to their hay, and Jed relaxed his grip, probably just a jackrabbit or a passing deer. Still, the unease lingered as he made his evening rounds, checking the stock, securing the barn, ensuring all was buttoned up tight for the night. The ride to town that morning had been uneventful, though he'd noticed fresh wagon tracks cutting across the old stage road, deeper than usual, suggesting heavy cargo. He'd picked up his usual supplies from Morrison's general store: flour, salt pork, ammunition, and a new bridle for his mare. The shopkeeper's wife had tried to engage him in gossip about some trouble brewing down near the Mexican border, but Jed had simply nodded, paid his bill, and left, now, as purple shadows stretched long fingers across the land. He saddled his horse for one last check of the property's outer boundaries. It was probably unnecessary. He'd seen nothing amiss during the day, but old habits died hard, and a vigilance had kept him alive this long. The mare picked her way carefully along the familiar trail that wound through a grove of cottonwoods near the creek, here, where water had carved a shallow canyon through the landscape. The terrain grew rough and broken. Massive boulders, deposited by some ancient flood, created a maze of hiding places and blind corners. It was beautiful country in its harsh way, but it was also dangerous, the kind of place where a man could disappear and never be found. As they rounded a particularly large outcropping, the mare suddenly shied, nearly unseating him. Jed fought to control her, his senses sharpening. Then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagination, carried on the wind like a ghost's whisper, a soft keening, almost like a wounded animal, but with something distinctly human about its pitch. He dismounted, ground-tying the nervous mare, and moved forward on foot, his hand once again finding the comfort of his pistol's grip. The sound came again, clearer now, from a thick stand of mesquite near the creek bed. As he approached, his boots silent on the sandy soil, he noticed something that made his blood run cold: fresh drag marks in the dirt. as if something heavy had been hauled into the brush. The twilight was fading fast, painting everything in shades of gray, but there was enough light to see the burlap sack wedged between two boulders, partially hidden by thorny branches. It was large, grain sack size, and it was moving. Jed's first thought was of the old stories, men left to die in the desert, tied up in sacks as punishment for cheating at cards or stealing horses. But those were usually left far from any ranch, out where the buzzards and coyotes would take care of the evidence. This was practically on his doorstep. He approached cautiously, every nerve alert for ambush. The movement in the sack had stilled, but now he could hear breathing, ragged, desperate gulps of air that spoke of someone fighting to stay conscious. With one swift motion, he drew his knife and sliced through the rope binding the sack's mouth. What he saw in the dying light made him stagger back a step. A woman, young, perhaps 25, with dark hair matted with blood and dirt. Her face was swollen with bruises, one eye completely shut, lips cracked and bleeding. Her dress, once fine blue calico, was torn and stained. She looked up at him with her one good eye, and he saw in it a wild mix of terror and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely more than a croak. "Please help me." The words came out broken, each one seeming to cost her tremendous effort. Her hand, trembling and weak, reached out toward him before falling limply back to her side. Jed knelt beside her, his mind racing. Who was she? How had she ended up here? And more importantly, were the people who'd done this still nearby? He scanned the darkening landscape, but saw nothing beyond the familiar shapes of rock and scrub. "Easy now," he said, surprised at how rough his own voice sounded after hours of silence. "I've got you." He cut away the rest of the sack, revealing more injuries. Rope burns on her wrists and ankles. Dark bruises across her ribs visible through the tears in her dress. Someone had beaten her systematically, cruelly, the kind of violence that spoke of either deep hatred or cold indifference to human suffering. She tried to speak again, but only managed a weak cough. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it to her lips, letting her take small sips. Most of it ran down her chin, but she managed to swallow a little. "Can you ride?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. She could barely keep her eyes open. The temperature was dropping fast now that the sun had set. Desert nights in November could be brutal, and in her condition, she wouldn't last long. He had to get her back to the ranch house, get her warm and tend to her injuries. But moving her would be difficult and potentially dangerous if she had internal injuries. Making his decision. Jed whistled for his mare. The horse approached reluctantly, still nervous from the scent of blood and fear. He gathered the woman in his arms as gently as possible, alarmed at how light she felt, like a broken bird. She moaned softly, but didn't fully wake. Getting her onto the horse proved challenging. In the end, he mounted first, then managed to pull her up to sit sideways in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He wrapped one arm around her to keep her secure and took the reins with the other. The ride back seemed endless. Every few minutes he checked to make sure she was still breathing, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her chest against his arm. The mare picked her way carefully through the darkness, trusting to her knowledge of the trail and her rider's guidance. By the time they reached the ranch house, full dark had fallen. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant witnesses to the strange turn his isolated life had suddenly taken. He carried her inside, laying her on the narrow bed in the spare room, the room that had stood empty since he'd built this place. In the lamplight, her injuries looked even worse. Someone had worked her over thoroughly, professionally even. This wasn't the result of a simple robbery or random violence. Someone had wanted something from her. Information, perhaps. Or maybe they'd simply wanted her to suffer. As he built up the fire in the stove and heated water for cleaning her wounds, Jed found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd spent 7 years building walls around his life, keeping the world and its troubles at arm's length. Now, trouble had literally been dumped on his doorstep. And despite every instinct telling him to ride to town and let the sheriff handle it, He couldn't bring himself to abandon her. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds scratching across the yard like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and its pack answered, their voices rising in a chorus that spoke of hunt and hunger. The sound sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He returned to the room with the water and clean cloth, along with a bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. She was conscious again, watching him with that one good eye as he approached. "This is going to hurt some," he warned, dipping the cloth in the warm water. She nodded slightly, her jaw set with determination. As he began to clean the blood from her face, she bit down on her already damaged lip to keep from crying out. He worked as quickly and gently as he could, but he could see what the effort cost her in the way her hands clenched the bedsheets. "What's your name?" he asked, partly to distract her from the pain. "Clara," she managed between clenched teeth. "Clara Bennett." The name meant nothing to him, but then again, he made it his business not to know much about the comings and goings of the wider world. "I'm Jed Carter. This is my ranch. You're safe now." At the word safe, something broke in her expression, and tears began to roll down her cheeks, not from physical pain, but from relief so profound it seemed to shake her entire body. They said no one would find me," she whispered, "that I'd die out there alone." "Well, they were wrong," Jed said firmly. "You're not alone now." As he continued tending her wounds, the lamp flame flickered in a sudden draft, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind had become a living thing, prowling around the house, testing windows and doors, bringing with it the promise of the long, uncertain night ahead. The night stretched long and uncertain, marked by the steady tick of the mantel clock and the occasional pop of wood in the stove. Jed had pulled a chair next to Clara's bed, unable to bring himself to leave her alone in her delirium. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out in fear, other times mumbling names he didn't recognize. Margaret, father, someone called Samuel. He kept the fire burning hot, knowing that warmth was crucial. Every hour, he checked her bandages, changed the cool compress on her forehead, and tried to get her to take small sips of water. The lamp burned low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough wooden walls like specters. Around midnight, she began shaking violently, her teeth chattering despite the pile of blankets he'd heaped upon her. He'd seen this before, shock setting in as the body finally realized it was safe enough to react to trauma. Without thinking, he kicked off his boots and lay down beside her on top of the covers, adding his body heat to help warm her. She instinctively turned toward him, seeking warmth like a wounded animal, and he held himself still, uncomfortable with the intimacy but understanding its necessity. By dawn, her fever had broken. Pale light filtered through the flour sack curtains, revealing her face more clearly. Beneath the bruises and swelling, he could see she'd been beautiful, fine-boned features that spoke of genteel upbringing, hands that were soft despite the rope burns, suggesting a life far removed from the hardscrabble existence of the frontier. When she finally woke properly, the sun was climbing toward noon. Her good eye focused on him with startling clarity. "Water?" she whispered. He helped her sit up, supporting her against the pillows, and held the cup to her lips. This time she managed to drink properly, though her hands shook too badly to hold it herself. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. Her voice was stronger now, though still hoarse. I was certain I would die out there." "What happened to you?" Jed asked, settling back in his chair. "Who did this?" Her expression darkened, fear flickering across her features. "The Colton gang. Do you know of them?" Jed's blood ran cold. He'd heard the name whispered in saloons and around campfires. Led by a man named Wade Colton, they were known for their brutality, operating along the border, hitting wagon trains and isolated homesteads with impunity. The law seemed unable or unwilling to stop them. "They hit our wagon train 3 days ago," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We were traveling from San Antonio to California. My father was taking our family west for a fresh start. He was a merchant, had sold everything. She paused, swallowing hard. There were 6 wagons. They came at dawn, riding hard out of a canyon. We never had a chance. The men tried to fight, but her voice broke. They killed them all. My father, my brother Samuel, the other men, even the boys who were barely 16. Jed poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, needing something to do with his hands. He'd heard similar stories too many times, but it never got easier. And the women? He asked, though he suspected he knew. Taken. They loaded us into a wagon, said we'd fetch good prices across the border. She looked down at her bandaged wrists. I fought them. That's why they beat me. Wade Colton himself did most of it. Said he needed to break my spirit before I'd be worth anything to buyers. The casual evil of it made Jed's jaw clench. How did you end up in that sack? 2 nights ago, when they made camp, I managed to work my bonds loose. I tried to free the others, but one of the guards caught me. Colton was furious. She touched her swollen face gingerly. He said he was done with me. That I was more trouble than I was worth. They put me in that sack, and one of them carried me on his horse for hours. I heard them laughing, saying they'd leave me somewhere the coyotes would find me, but far enough from any trail that no person would. But they left you on my land. She nodded slowly. I heard one of them say something about teaching the hermit rancher a lesson, that maybe finding a body would convince you to be more accommodating next time they pass through. Jed stood abruptly, pacing to the window. So it hadn't been random. They knew about him, knew about his isolation, his refusal to pay their protection fees when their messenger had come by 6 months ago. He'd run the man off his land at gunpoint, thinking that would be the end of it. I'm sorry, Clara said quietly. I've brought danger to your door. He turned back to her. You didn't bring anything. They did this, not you. He studied her for a moment. What about the other women? Tears welled in her good eye. My sister Margaret. She's only 17. And Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Garcia, the Wilkins sisters. 6 others besides me. They still have them. She struggled to sit up straighter. I have to go to the law. They have to send help before it's too late. The law, Jed said flatly. You mean Sheriff Briggs in Clearwater? Yes, surely Sheriff Briggs is a good man for breaking up saloon fights and tracking down horse thieves. But the Colton gang, they've got 30 men, maybe more, and they pay their bribes regular to make sure nobody looks too close at their business. The bitterness in his voice was sharp as alkali. The law won't help you. Clara's face crumpled. Then they're lost. Margaret is lost. Jed returned to his chair, his mind working. When they dumped you, did you hear anything about where they were headed? She thought carefully. They mentioned Skeleton Ridge. Something about meeting buyers there in 4 days' time. That would be... She calculated. Day after tomorrow now. Skeleton Ridge. Jed knew it. A maze of box canyons and hidden trails 50 miles south. Perfect for ambushes and secret meetings. A small force could hold off an army in that terrain if they knew the land. You need to rest, he said finally. Get your strength back. I'll make some broth. He moved to the kitchen area, his movements automatic as he prepared a simple meal. His mind, however, was far from the task at hand. The Colton gang had made 2 mistakes. They'd left Clara alive, and they'd made it personal by dumping her on his land. He'd spent 7 years trying to bury the man he'd been before, the man who'd learned to track and fight during the Indian Wars, who'd killed when necessary and slept sound after, but some things, it seemed, couldn't stay buried. The rest of the day passed quietly. Clara managed to eat a little, though her jaw was still too sore for anything solid, between periods of rest. She told him more about her family, about the life they'd left behind in San Antonio. Her father had owned a dry goods store. Her mother had died of fever 2 years prior. The journey west was supposed to be a new beginning. As evening approached, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rain. Jed checked the stock, secured the outbuildings. all the while aware of how exposed the ranch was. If the Colton gang decided to check on their handiwork, he and Clara would be vastly outnumbered. That night, he didn't pretend to keep watch from the chair. He bedded down on the floor beside her bed, his rifle within easy reach. The house creaked and settled around them, every sound potentially threatening. "Jed?" Clara's voice came soft in the darkness. "Yeah. Why do you live out here alone?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "Had family once. Indians took them while I was away. Figured if I couldn't protect the people I loved, maybe it was better not to have anyone to protect. That's a lonely way to live. It's a safe way to live." "Is it?" she asked. "Seems to me you're protecting someone now." He had no answer for that. The next morning brought low gray clouds and the promise of rain. Clara was able to stand with help, though she swayed dangerously. Jed caught her elbow, steadying her. "I need to get to town," she insisted. "Even if the sheriff won't form a posse, maybe I can wire the Rangers or the Army." "You can barely stand. You're not riding anywhere? Then you go, please. Every hour we waste. I'm not leaving you here alone." His tone brooked no argument. "They think you're dead. Let's keep it that way for now." He helped her to the main room, settling her in the big chair by the fire. The house felt different with her in it, smaller somehow, but also more alive. He caught himself noticing things he'd ignored for years: the bare walls, the lack of any softness or comfort beyond the strictly functional. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he prepared breakfast. Clara watched him work, her one good eye following his efficient movements. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. "Once. My brother wanted to be a soldier. Said it was a man's duty to serve." Her voice caught. "He was only 19. Jed set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of her. "Eat what you can." As she picked at the food, he found himself studying her in return, even battered and bruised. There was a strength to her, a core of steel beneath the obvious refinement. She'd survived what would have broken many, and she was still thinking of others, still fighting. The rain started just after noon, a steady drumming on the roof that masked other sounds. Jed found himself pacing, checking windows, unable to settle. The waiting was always the hardest part. "You're thinking of going after them," Clara said quietly. He stopped pacing. "I'm thinking lots of things. 1 man against 30, those aren't good odds. Depends on the man, depends on the terrain." She was quiet for a moment. "I can't ask you to do that. You've already done more than—" "You're not asking." He met her gaze steadily. "But those women don't have time for us to debate it. And the Colton gang made it my business when they left you on my land to die." The rain intensified, turning the yard into a sea of mud. Somewhere out there, Clara's sister and the other women were facing another night of captivity, another day closer to a fate worse than death. And here he sat, safe in his self-imposed isolation, pretending the world beyond his fence lines didn't exist. But it did exist. Evil existed. And sometimes, whether a man wanted it or not, the world came calling, demanding he choose a side. As darkness fell and the storm raged overhead, Jed Carter sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, while Clara Bennett dozed fitfully in the chair beside him. The die was cast, though neither had spoken it aloud. Come morning, if the storm had passed, he would ride for Skeleton Ridge. The hermit rancher's carefully constructed solitude had been shattered as surely as if the Colton gang had kicked in his door, and perhaps, in the end, that's exactly what they'd done. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling under a brilliant morning sun. Clara stood at the window, her face still swollen but the bruising beginning to yellow at the edges. She could move more easily now, though Jed noticed how she favored her left side where her ribs were likely cracked. "You slept better," he observed, handing her a cup of coffee. She accepted it gratefully, wrapping both hands around its warmth. "First time in days without nightmares." She paused, studying his face. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" He shrugged. turning back to the stove where bacon sizzled in the pan. Sleep had eluded him as he'd wrestled with decisions and plans, running through scenarios and possibilities. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. "After breakfast, I'll take you outside," he said. "Fresh air will do you good." Her face lit up at the prospect. The first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her features, giving him a glimpse of who she'd been before violence had marked her. An hour later, he helped her onto the porch, where she settled into the old rocking chair he'd built but rarely used. The view stretched endlessly, rolling grassland dotted with mesquite and sage, the mountains purple smudges on the horizon. The rain had brought out the sharp, clean scent of creosote, and meadowlarks called from the fence posts. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed. "So different from San Antonio, but beautiful in its own harsh way." Most folks don't see it that way. They see emptiness, danger. Maybe that's because they're looking for what they left behind instead of seeing what's actually here. She closed her eyes, lifting her face to the sun. "I used to think I needed shops and society, neighbors close by, but there's something to be said for silence." Jed leaned against the porch rail, watching her. In the golden morning light, he could see past the damage to the woman underneath. Thoughtful, resilient, finding beauty even after brutality. "Tell me about your sister," he said. Clara's expression softened. "Margaret is everything I'm not. Where I'm cautious, she's bold. Where I think things through. She leaps first and worries later. Father used to say she was born with wanderlust in her blood." Her voice caught. "She was so excited about California, said she'd finally have adventures worth writing about." "Writing?" She kept journals, filled dozens of them with stories and observations. Said someday she'd be a real author, like those lady writers back east. Clara's knuckles whitened as she gripped the coffee cup. "She's strong, stronger than she knows. But 17 is so young for what they have planned." Jed turned to scan the horizon, a habit so ingrained he did it without thinking. The Colton gang usually moves fast. If they're meeting buyers at Skeleton Ridge tomorrow, they'll likely hole up somewhere close tonight. You know this country well. Well enough. He'd spent months after his family's death riding every trail, memorizing every water source and hidden canyon, partly from restlessness, but mostly from a need to know every possible approach to his new home. There's an old Spanish mission about 10 miles from the ridge. Abandoned now, but the walls still stand. Good defensive position, water nearby. Clara stood carefully, moving to stand beside him. "You're going after them." It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "A man can't unsee what he's seen, can't unknow what he knows. I want to come with you." He turned sharply. "Absolutely not. She's my sister. Those are my people. And you can barely walk across the room without swaying. You'd slow me down, put us both at risk." His tone was firm, but not unkind. "Best thing you can do for Margaret is let me handle this my way." She wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her jaw, but practicality won out. "What if you don't come back? Then you take my horse and ride for Clearwater. Tell Sheriff Briggs everything. Wire the Rangers." He moved past her into the house, returning with paper and pencil. "Write down everything you remember. Names, descriptions, anything that might help identify the women if—" He didn't finish the sentence. They spent the next hour with Clara providing every detail she could recall. Wade Colton was a big man, weathered by sun and wind, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw. His segundo, a Mexican called Vasquez, was quieter but possibly more dangerous. She described the other women, their families, anything that might help. As the sun climbed higher, Jed began his preparations. He cleaned and loaded his Winchester, checked his Colt, sharpened his knife. Clara watched from her chair as he packed saddlebags with ammunition, jerky, hardtack, and canteens. "You move like someone preparing for war," she observed. "In a way, I am." He paused in his preparations. "I learned a long time ago that violence is like fire, sometimes necessary, always dangerous, never to be taken lightly. But when someone brings it to your door, you meet it on your terms or become its victim. He disappeared into the barn, returning with items that made Clara's eyes widen: a second rifle, field glasses, and a bedroll so worn it looked like it had seen 100 campaigns. "There's food in the larder," he told her as he secured everything to his saddle. "Keep the doors barred. Don't light lamps after dark. If anyone comes, and I mean anyone, there's a loaded shotgun behind the door. Use it." "Jed." She caught his sleeve as he turned to go. "Why are you really doing this? And don't tell me it's about them leaving me on your land." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out across the grassland. 7 years ago, I was 3 days away when my family needed me. 3 days too far to make a difference? I've lived with that every day since." He met her gaze. "Maybe I can't change what happened then, but I can choose what happens now." She squeezed his arm gently. "They were lucky to have someone who cared so much. As am I." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes. "I'll bring her back. Clara, I'll bring them all back if I can." "I know you will." He mounted his horse, a rangy bay gelding built for endurance rather than speed. Clara stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes against the sun. In her borrowed clothes, one of his shirts and a pair of pants cinched tight with rope, she looked smaller, more vulnerable, but also somehow fitting against the backdrop of his home. "There's something else," she called out as he turned to leave. "Wade Colton. He kept talking about a big score coming. Said after this job, they'd have enough to buy their own hacienda down in Mexico. Live like kings, I think. I think we weren't random targets. I think someone hired them to clear that wagon train." This was new information, and troubling. It suggested a level of planning beyond the gang's usual opportunistic raids. Jed filed it away to think on later. "Bar the door," he said again, then touched his heels to the gelding's sides. Clara watched until horse and rider were swallowed by the immensity of the landscape, becoming just another speck of movement in the vast canvas of grass and sky. Then she turned back to the empty house, her sanctuary and prison both, to begin her own vigil. The sun tracked across the sky as Jed rode steadily south, stopping only to water his horse at a hidden spring he knew. The land here was rougher, cut by arroyos and studded with volcanic rock. Good ambush country. He kept to the low ground when possible, using every bit of cover. By late afternoon, he'd reached the edges of familiar territory. The mission Clara had mentioned would be another 5 miles, but approaching in daylight would be suicide. He found a sheltered canyon with good sight lines and made cold camp, hobbling the gelding where it could graze. As darkness fell, he sat with his back against a boulder, chewing jerky and thinking about the woman he'd left behind. In just 2 days, she disrupted the careful emptiness he'd cultivated, brought life back into spaces he deliberately left hollow. Her presence had reminded him of things he'd tried to forget: the comfort of shared silence, the warmth of another person's trust, the weight of having someone to protect. He dozed fitfully, old soldier's habits keeping him alert to any change in the night sounds. Somewhere in the darkness, a screech owl called, its eerie cry echoing off the canyon walls. Other nights, in other places, he'd heard similar sounds before violence came calling. Dawn was still an hour away when he saddled up and moved out, using the pre-dawn darkness to cover his approach. The mission came into view as the eastern sky began to lighten, crumbling adobe walls rising from the desert floor like broken teeth. The bell tower long since collapsed. He ground-tied the gelding in a wash a 1/4 mile out and approached on foot, moving with the patience of a hunter. The field glasses revealed what he'd expected: horses in the old courtyard, the glow of a fire, men moving about in the lazy way of those who believed themselves safe. 30 men, Clara had said, but he counted only 12. Either the gang had split up or she'd overestimated their numbers in her fear. Still too many for a direct assault, but better odds than he'd expected. He settled in to watch and wait, noting routines, identifying leaders, looking for where the prisoners might be held. The sun rose fully, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. and still he waited with the patience that had once made him valuable to the army. Then he saw her, a girl with Clara's same dark hair but taller, younger, being led from one of the intact buildings. Even from this distance, he could see the defiance in her posture, the way she held her head high despite her bound hands. Margaret Bennet was indeed her sister's kin. The other women followed, 6 in all as Clara had said, being herded toward a wagon. They were loading up, preparing to move to the final meeting place. If he was going to act, it had to be soon. Jed studied the terrain one more time, noting approach routes and escape paths, calculating distances and angles. 12 men, 6 prisoners, 1 rifle, 1 pistol, and the element of surprise. He'd faced worse odds and lived to tell about it. Of course, he'd been younger then, fighting alongside men he trusted. Now he was alone, 7 years out of practice, fighting for women he didn't know. But as he watched Margaret Bennet stumble and help another woman to her feet despite her own bonds, he thought of Clara waiting back at the ranch, trusting him to do what she couldn't. Sometimes a man's worth wasn't measured in the fights he won, but in the ones he was willing to face. The mission bells had long since fallen silent, but in his mind, Jed heard them tolling as he began his careful descent toward the ancient walls. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor, and somewhere in those shadows, death was waiting to see which way the dice would fall. The morning after Jed's departure, Clara woke to an empty house that seemed to echo with absence. She moved carefully through her morning routine, her body still protesting but growing stronger. The shotgun behind the door drew her eye repeatedly, a stark reminder of the danger that might yet find her. She spent the early hours exploring the house more thoroughly than her injuries had previously allowed. It was a bachelor's dwelling through and through, functional, sparse, without a single unnecessary item. Yet there were hints of the man beneath the solitude, a shelf of well-worn books, mostly histories and agricultural guides, a chess set gathering dust on a side table, a daguerreotype tucked behind some harness leather showing a family group, the faces too faded to make out clearly. By midday, restlessness drove her outside despite Jed's warnings. The ranch yard was quiet save for the chickens scratching in their pen and horses dozing in the corral. She fed them, drawing water from the well with difficulty, her ribs protesting each movement. The vast emptiness around the ranch should have frightened her, but instead she found it oddly comforting. There was honesty in this landscape. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. After the false smiles and hidden violence she'd encountered, the desert's frank hostility was almost refreshing. As afternoon wore on, she noticed dust on the northern horizon. Her heart hammered as she retreated to the house, barring the door and positioning herself where she could see the approach while staying hidden. But it was only old Tom Mackenzie, Jed's neighbor, come to return a borrowed tool. "Jed around?" the grizzled rancher called from his horse, making no move to dismount. Clara stayed silent, remembering Jed's warnings about trusting no one. Mackenzie waited a moment, then shrugged. "Tell him I brought his hammer back. Left it by the barn." He studied the house with knowing eyes. "You need anything, ma'am, and I know you're in there. You fire 3 shots in the air. I'll hear 'em." After he left, Clara ventured out to retrieve the hammer, wondering at the unexpected kindness. Perhaps Jed wasn't as isolated as he believed. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the land, Clara found herself at Jed's desk, pen in hand. She'd already written the report he'd requested, but now she wrote something else, a letter to Margaret, though she might never receive it. She wrote of hope and strength, of the unexpected kindness of strangers, of how even in the darkest moments, light could find a way in. The night passed slowly. Every coyote's call, every whisper of wind, had her reaching for the shotgun. She dozed fitfully in the chair by the fire, starting awake at imagined hoofbeats. Dawn found her exhausted, but determined, understanding a fraction of what Jed must have endured during 7 years of such nights. On the second day, she grew bolder. Her body was healing, the swelling in her face receding enough that both eyes could open fully. She organized the medical supplies, cleaned what already seemed clean, and even attempted to bake bread with limited success. The activity helped quiet the voices in her head, the ones that whispered of all the things that could go wrong, all the ways this rescue could fail. Late in the afternoon, as she was tending the horses, she heard it, the drumming of many hooves approaching fast. This was no single neighbor come calling. Clara ran for the house, her heart pounding. She'd barely gotten inside and barred the door when the riders appeared, 5 men, hard-faced and travel-worn, circling the property like wolves. "Hello, the house," one called. "We're looking for a woman, escaped prisoner, sheriff's business." Clara knew better than to believe them. No sheriff would send men who looked like these. She stayed silent, the shotgun heavy in her hands. "We know someone's in there," another rider said. "Smoke from the chimney gives you away. Come on out, and nobody gets hurt." Still, she said nothing, though her palms were slick with sweat. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched them confer. These weren't Colton's men, she'd have recognized them, but they were clearly hunting her. One dismounted, approaching the door. "Last chance. Lady, open up, or we'll—" Clara fired through the door. The shotgun's roar deafening in the small space. The man dove aside, cursing. She quickly reloaded, her hands surprisingly steady. "That's buckshot, gentlemen," she called out, finding her voice. "The next one goes lower. I suggest you move along." There was scrambling outside, harsh voices arguing. She heard one say something about not worth it, and another mentioning Carter. "This is Carter land," she added, pressing her advantage. "He doesn't take kindly to trespassers. Neither do I." More argument. Then the one who'd first spoken called out. "You tell Carter he can't protect you forever. Wade Colton has a long memory and a longer reach." They mounted up and rode off, but Clara kept watch until they were dust on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to sink into a chair, shaking with delayed reaction. She defended herself, defended Jed's home. The realization was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. That night, she kept the fire low and moved away from the windows. If those men were scouts for the gang, if they reported back that she was alive and here, she pushed the thought away. Jed would return. She had to believe that. The third day dawned clear and cold. Clara had slept little, starting at every sound. As she made coffee with the last of the grounds, she realized she'd need to venture to the root cellar for supplies soon. The simple domesticity of the concern almost made her laugh. Here she was, worried about coffee and flour while somewhere her sister might be. No, she wouldn't think like that. Instead, she focused on the immediate, feeding the animals, maintaining the ranch, preparing for whatever came next. She was cleaning the breakfast dishes when she heard it. A single horse, moving slow. Every nerve screamed danger. A lone rider could mean anything, a scout, a neighbor, or Jed returning alone, having failed. She took position by the window, shotgun ready, and waited. The rider came into view, slumped in the saddle, and Clara's heart leapt. It was Jed's bay gelding, but as they drew closer, she saw the rider wasn't Jed at all. It was a woman, barely keeping her seat, dark hair matted with trail dust. Clara threw open the door and ran out as the girl, really, half fell from the saddle. "Clara," the girl whispered, and Clara's knees nearly buckled. "Margaret! Oh, Margaret!" She caught her sister as she collapsed, noting the rope burns on her wrists, the exhaustion in every line of her body. Where's Jed? The others? He sent me ahead," Margaret managed as Clara helped her inside. "Said to tell you, to get ready. They're coming, all of them. He's bringing them home." Relief flooded through Clara so intense it left her dizzy. But Margaret wasn't finished. "But Colton's men, they're following, maybe an hour behind. He said to prepare for a fight." Clara settled her sister in the bed Jed had given up for her, mind racing. An hour, maybe less. She had to think, had to prepare. Margaret caught her hand with surprising strength. "He saved us. Clara. Came out of nowhere like the wrath of God himself. I've never seen anything like it." Her eyes, so like Clara's own, were bright with fever and something else. Hope. He promised he'd get us all home. Even while the bullets were flying, he was so calm, so sure. Rest now, Clara soothed, though her mind was spinning with preparations. I'll take care of everything. She barricaded the windows, loaded every weapon she could find, filled buckets with water in case of fire. The lessons of the past 3 days crystallized into action. She was no longer the merchant's daughter who'd been stuffed in a sack to die. She was a woman defending her home. For that's what this place had become. She realized, in just days, this sparse ranch house had become more of a home than anywhere she'd lived. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when she saw the dust cloud approaching from the south, many riders, moving fast. Clara positioned herself at the front window, Margaret's revolver in her hand. Her sister had insisted she take it, along with quick instructions on its use. But as the group drew closer, she saw the wagon in their midst, saw the familiar figure of Jed Carter riding point, and her heart soared. Behind him rode women, her fellow captives, free and alive, and behind them, pursuing hard, came more riders, the sunlight glinting off their weapons. Clara made her choice. Instead of staying barricaded inside, she grabbed the rifle and extra ammunition and ran for the barn, taking position in the hayloft where she'd have a clear field of fire. If this was to be a battle, she'd not cower inside while others fought for her. The rescue party thundered into the yard, Jed already shouting orders. "Into the house! Move!" He swung down from his horse, that same deadly calm Margaret had described evident in every motion. The women scrambled from the wagon, Clara catching glimpses of familiar faces. Mrs. Patterson, the Wilkins sisters, others as they ran for cover. Some were helping each other, all showing the signs of their ordeal but alive, blessedly alive. "Carter!" a voice boomed from the approaching riders. Wade Colton himself, scarred face twisted with rage. "You've taken something that belongs to me." "I've taken nothing but what you stole first," Jed called back, taking position behind the water trough. "These women are under my protection now. Ride on and live." Colton's laugh was ugly. "Big talk for one man. He's not alone," Clara called out, letting them see the rifle barrel from the loft. One by one, windows in the house opened, showing the rescued women armed with whatever they'd found. "Neither are you, from what I see," Jed observed, his voice carrying that same conversational tone Clara remembered from their first meeting. "Question is, how many of your men are you willing to lose for pride?" The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Clara counted 8 riders with Colton, fewer than she'd feared, but still too many. Her hands were steady on the rifle, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. "He promised he'd get us all home." "You can't guard them forever, Carter," Colton finally said. "This isn't over." "Yes," Jed said quietly, but his voice carried clearly. "It is." Something in his tone, in the absolute certainty of it, seemed to reach even Colton. The outlaw leader stared at Jed for a long moment, then at the fortified house, the armed women, the defensible position. Clara could see him calculating odds, weighing costs. Finally, he wheeled his horse around. "This isn't finished," he snarled, but he was already riding away, his men following reluctantly. They watched until the gang disappeared over a rise, then watched some more. Only when Jed finally lowered his weapon did Clara climb down from the loft. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him in relief and gratitude, but something in his bearing held her back. Instead, she walked slowly across the yard, aware of eyes watching from the house. When she reached him, she simply said, "You kept your promise." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the toll the rescue had taken, not physically, though she noted blood on his sleeve, but deeper. He'd crossed back over a line he'd drawn for himself, become again the warrior he'd tried to leave behind. "They're all safe," he said. "Your sister's idea to ride ahead was smart, bought us time. She said you were magnificent, like the wrath of God." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Just a man who remembered some old skills. He glanced toward the house. They'll need tending, food, rest, medical attention. Some are in rough shape. We'll manage, Clara assured him. Together. The word hung between them, weighted with possibility. Then the moment broke as Margaret appeared in the doorway, calling Clara's name, and the immediate needs of the rescued women took precedence. But as Clara turned to go, Jed caught her hand briefly. You held the ranch, he said quietly. Heard you had visitors. I learned from a good teacher, she replied, squeezing his fingers before letting go. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity, tending wounds, preparing food, making sleeping arrangements for 8 women in a house built for one. Through it all, Clara watched Jed navigate the sudden invasion of his solitude with surprising grace, though she could see the strain and the tightness around his eyes. As night fell and the women settled into exhausted sleep wherever they could find space, Clara found Jed on the porch, keeping watch as she'd known he would be. They'll need to get to town tomorrow, he said without preamble. Need to report to the law, wire their families. I know. She sat beside him, close enough to share warmth against the cold night air. What about Colton? He'll think twice before coming back here. But he's right about one thing. I can't guard everyone forever. He was quiet for a moment. Might be time I stopped trying to live like a ghost. Can't protect what matters if nobody knows you exist. And what matters, Jed Carter? She asked softly. He turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw the answer before he spoke it aloud. The lonely rancher had opened more than just a sack 3 days ago. He'd opened his life, his heart, his carefully guarded world, and in saving others, he'd perhaps saved himself as well. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the trip to town, dealing with the law, deciding what came next for all of them. But tonight, sitting together on the porch of a ranch that no longer felt empty, watching stars appear one by one in the vast Texas sky. Clara Bennett and Jed Carter had found something neither had been looking for, but both had desperately needed. They'd found their forever. The journey to Clearwater began at first light, a somber procession of survivors making their way across the desert landscape. Jed had borrowed Tom Mackenzie's wagon, and the old rancher himself rode along as additional protection. The women huddled together in the wagon bed, some silent, others speaking in low voices about their ordeal and their hopes for reunion with whatever family remained. Clara rode beside the wagon on one of Jed's horses, having insisted she was well enough. Her sister Margaret sat with the other women, her journal balanced on her knees as she documented everything with determined strokes of her pencil. The similarity between the sisters was even more apparent now. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set to their jaws, though Margaret's face held a younger softness that her ordeal hadn't quite erased. Jed rode point, his Winchester across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. Getting the women to safety was only the first step. Ensuring justice followed would be harder. Quite a thing you did, Tom Mackenzie said, pulling his horse alongside Jed's. Whole territory's going to hear about this. That's what I'm afraid of. Jed replied quietly. Maybe it's time they did. You've been hiding out here long enough, boy. Your folks wouldn't have wanted you to bury yourself with them. Jed's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Tom, proving why he'd been a good neighbor all these years, didn't push. They reached Clearwater by mid-morning, and their arrival caused an immediate stir. People emerged from shops and houses, drawn by the unusual sight. Sheriff Briggs hurried out of his office, his weathered face showing shock as he recognized some of the women. Mrs. Patterson? Lord Almighty, we thought you were all dead. The stage line reported the massacre 2 weeks ago. Would have been, if not for Mr. Carter. Mrs. Patterson said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He came for us when no one else would. The sheriff's gaze found Jed, a mix of surprise and something like shame crossing his features. Carter, we had no idea any survivors. Colton's gang took them, Jed said flatly. Aimed to sell them across the border. Might still be operating if someone had listened when Miss Bennet escaped. Clara moved to stand beside him, her presence a quiet support. We need to wire the territorial marshal. Sheriff, Wade Colton threatened to return. These women won't be safe until he's brought to justice. The crowd was growing, townspeople recognizing the gravity of the situation. Doc Morrison pushed through, immediately beginning to assess injuries. The hotel owner offered free rooms. Women from the church auxiliary appeared with blankets and hot food. "I'll wire the marshal right away," Sheriff Briggs said, clearly overwhelmed. "And the Rangers, this is bigger than—" "I'm sorry, Miss Bennet. When you disappeared, we assumed—" "You assumed I was dead," Clara finished quietly, "because that was easier than forming a posse." The sheriff flushed but didn't deny it. Jed stepped forward. "What's done is done. Question is, what happens next? These women need protection until Colton is caught or driven out of the territory." "I'll post deputies," the sheriff promised, though everyone knew his 2 part-time deputies would be little deterrent to hardened outlaws. As the women were helped to the hotel, Clara caught Jed's arm. "Where are you going?" "Need to send some telegrams of my own, then resupply." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "This isn't my world anymore? Clara, these people, this town—" "It could be," she said softly, "if you let it." He studied her face, seeing past the fading bruises to the hope beneath. "I'll be back," he said finally. "Need to see this through." The telegraph office was busy, word having spread quickly. Jed sent messages to Fort Worth, to the Rangers, to contacts he hadn't used in 7 years. If the law wouldn't act decisively, perhaps old debts and favors would accomplish what duty hadn't. At Morrison's store, he found himself face to face with more attention than he'd endured in years. People who'd dismissed him as an antisocial hermit now wanted to shake his hand, hear the story, offer rewards he didn't want. "Heard you took on 12 men single-handed," one cowboy said with awe. "Heard it was 20. Another chimed in. Jed collected his supplies without comment, but he noticed Clara watching from the hotel porch, a small smile playing at her lips as she observed his discomfort with the attention. That evening, the hotel dining room became an impromptu gathering place. The rescued women, cleaned up and fed, looked more like themselves, though the shadows in their eyes remained. Margaret held court at one table, her natural storytelling ability drawing listeners as she recounted their rescue. "He came at dawn," she was saying, "like something out of a dime novel, but real, you understand? No dramatics, no speeches, just deadly efficiency. He knew exactly where they held us, exactly how to get us out." Clara found Jed on the hotel's side porch, avoiding the crowd. "You're a hero to them," she said, joining him on the bench. "I'm no hero, just did what needed doing." "Isn't that what heroes do?" She was quiet for a moment. "Margaret told me what you did, how you used their own superstitions against them, making them think they were under attack from multiple directions, how you freed them while most of the gang was chasing shadows. Old cavalry tricks," he said dismissively. "She also told me you were wounded, that one of Colton's men got you with a knife before you." She didn't finish. Jed unconsciously touched his left side where bandages bulked under his shirt. "It's nothing. Let me see. Clara, please." He sighed but unbuttoned his shirt enough to show the bandaging. Blood had seeped through in spots. Clara's breath caught. "You need proper medical attention. Had worse. That's not the point." Her fingers ghosted over the bandage, careful not to cause pain. "You could have bled to death out there, but I didn't." He caught her hand gently. "And your sister is safe." "They all are. That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. From inside came the sound of voices, of life returning to normal, or as normal as it could be after such events. "What happens now?" Clara asked eventually. "Rangers should be here in a few days. They'll hunt Colton down. These women will reunite with their families or make new plans." He paused. "You and Margaret will decide what to do about California." "Father's dream," Clara said softly. "It seems like a lifetime ago. So much has changed. You could still go, start fresh. She turned to look at him directly. "Is that what you want, for us to go?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Before he could answer, Sheriff Briggs appeared, looking harried. "Carter, Miss Bennett, just got word from my deputy watching the South Road. Riders coming in hard. Could be Colton." Jed stood immediately, the moment broken. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Bold as brass if it's really them." "It's them," Jed said grimly. "Colton's not one to let a challenge pass. Get everyone inside. Sheriff, this ends tonight." The town transformed in minutes. Women and children were hustled indoors. Men took positions at windows and on rooftops. Jed found himself at the center of the defense, his quiet competence drawing others to follow his lead. Clara refused to hide with the other women. "I started this," she said firmly. "I'll see it finished." Margaret appeared with her revolver. "Where Clara goes, I go." Jed didn't waste time arguing. He positioned them at the hotel's upper windows where they'd have good sight lines and cover. The riders appeared as the last light faded, moving slowly down Main Street. Wade Colton rode in front, his scarred face visible in the lamplight spilling from windows. Behind him rode 3 men, including Vasquez. "Carter," Colton called out, "you've caused me considerable trouble. Cost me money, cost me men. That demands satisfaction." Jed stepped out of the sheriff's office, badge glinting on his chest. Briggs had deputized him moments before. "Wade Colton, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and sundry other crimes. Throw down your weapons." Colton laughed. "You think that tin badge changes anything? You're still one man. Look around." "Colton," Sheriff Briggs called from the hotel. "He's not alone this time." Windows bristled with rifle barrels. Tom Mackenzie was visible on the mercantile roof. Even Doc Morrison had a shotgun. "This is what you missed, living outside the law," Jed said calmly. "Community, people standing together. You prey on the isolated, the vulnerable, but together, we're stronger than you'll ever be." Colton's hand moved toward his gun. "Pretty words won't stop bullets." "No," Clara called from the hotel window, her rifle trained on him. "But they will." The outlaw leader's eyes found her, and his face twisted with rage. "You should have made sure you were dead. Your first mistake." Clara replied steadily. "Not your last." The tension stretched taut. Then Vasquez leaned over to whisper urgently to Colton. The arithmetic was clear. Even if they won, they'd die in the process. The town had found its courage. "This isn't over." Colton snarled. "Yes, it is," Jed said with finality. "Ride out now, and keep riding. Show your face in this territory again, and we'll finish what you started." For a long moment, violence trembled on the edge of erupting. Then Colton wheeled his horse around. "You'll regret this, Carter. All of you will." They watched the outlaws ride out, waiting until they were well gone before anyone relaxed. A cheer went up from the townspeople. Premature perhaps, but heartfelt. "They'll be back," Sheriff Briggs said quietly to Jed. "No," Jed replied. "They won't. Colton's practical above all. He'll find easier prey elsewhere. And if I'm wrong," he looked up at Clara, still at her window, "we'll be ready." Later that night, after the excitement died down and the town settled into uneasy sleep, Jed found himself back at the ranch with the Bennett sisters. They'd insisted on returning with him, Clara arguing someone needed to tend his wound properly, and Margaret declaring she had to document everything while it was fresh. As Clara carefully cleaned and rebandaged his injury, her touch infinitely gentle, Jed realized his solitary life had ended the moment he'd cut open that sack. The walls he'd built so carefully had crumbled, leaving him exposed but somehow stronger for it. "Thank you," Clara said softly as she secured the fresh bandage. "For everything. You thanked me already. Several times. Not just for saving us, for reminding me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about acting despite the fear." She met his eyes. "You taught me that." From the main room came the sound of Margaret's pen scratching across paper. documenting their story for posterity, or perhaps for the dime novels she dreamed of writing. "What will you do now?" Jed asked. "You and Margaret?" Clara was quiet for a moment, her hands still resting lightly on his chest. "I've been thinking about that. We have some money from Father's estate, enough to start over anywhere." She paused. "Maybe even enough to invest in a ranch that needs expanding, if the owner was willing to take on partners." Jed's breath caught. "Clara, I know it's forward of me. I know we've only known each other days, but sometimes—" She smiled softly. "Sometimes you just know when you've found where you belong." He covered her hands with his. "It won't be easy. Ranch life is hard. Isolated. I've had a taste of it. I think I could grow to love it, especially with the right teacher." From the doorway, Margaret's voice carried a smile. "If you two are done making cow eyes at each other, I need Clara to verify some details for my journal." Clara blushed but didn't move away. "In a moment. Margaret?" The younger woman laughed. "I'll just say this. If we're staying, I call dibs on the room with the best light for writing. This story is going to make me famous. You know, The Lonely Rancher in the Sack, a true tale of Western romance." "Margaret," Clara protested. But she was laughing. Jed found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. His house, no, their house, was full of laughter and life. The ghosts that had haunted him for 7 years seemed fainter now, overlaid with new memories, new possibilities. Outside, the desert night stretched endless and dark, full of dangers still. Wade Colton was out there somewhere, nursing his wounds and his grudges. Other threats would come: weather, sickness, the 1,000 challenges of frontier life. But inside, in the warm circle of lamplight, with Clara's hand in his and Margaret's cheerful chatter filling the silence, Jed Carter was no longer alone. The lonely rancher had opened a sack and found not just a woman in need of rescue, but a future he'd never dared imagine. The sun hung low and blood-red over Skeleton Ridge, casting long shadows across the maze of canyons and arroyos that made this country perfect for ambush. Jed Carter crouched behind a limestone outcropping, his field glasses trained on the activity below. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in Clearwater. 3 days of mounting tension as reports trickled in of Colton's gang gathering strength, pulling in outlaws from across the territory. The Rangers hadn't come. Their telegram had been terse, engaged with Comanche raids to the north, unable to spare men. The territorial marshal offered similar excuses. It seemed Wade Colton had chosen his moment well, when legitimate law was stretched thin, so Jed had made his own plans. Beside him, Tom Mackenzie shifted carefully, mindful of loose rocks that might betray their position. The old rancher had insisted on coming, along with 2 of his hands. "Been too long since this territory stood up for itself," he'd said simply. Below them, in a natural bowl formed by ancient erosion, Colton's camp sprawled in apparent confidence. Jed counted 20 men now, the original gang supplemented by border trash drawn by promises of easy money. They'd made camp near Skeleton Springs, the only reliable water for miles. Exactly where Jed had hoped they would. "There," Tom whispered, pointing to a cluster of men near the largest tent. "That's Colton, ain't it?" Jed focused his glasses. Wade Colton stood arguing with Vasquez, his scarred face animated with anger, even from this distance. Jed could sense the tension in the camp. Colton's failed intimidation of Clearwater had shaken his men's confidence. Some were probably wondering if their leader had lost his edge. "Signal the others," Jed said quietly. "Sun'll be down in an hour. We move then." Tom produced a small mirror, flashing it in a predetermined pattern. Across the canyon, barely visible among the rocks, an answering flash confirmed the message received. Sheriff Briggs was over there with 5 deputized townsmen, shopkeepers and clerks mostly, but motivated by the threat to their community. On the eastern approach, Doc Morrison led another group, including 2 former soldiers who'd settled in the area. It wasn't much of an army, but it was what they had. Jed made his way back to where the horses were hidden, finding Clara checking her rifle for the 10th time. He'd tried to convince her to stay in town, but she'd fixed him with those dark eyes and said simply, "My fight too." Margaret had wanted to come as well, but Clara had put her foot down. Someone needed to stay with the other women, to coordinate defenses if everything went wrong. "Well?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the tension he could see in her shoulders. "They're there, confident, careless." He checked his own weapons, the Winchester, his Colt, the knife that had saved his life more than once. "Remember, once it starts, stay with the horses unless things go bad. You're our reserve." She nodded, though he could see she chafed at being held back. "Be careful," she said softly. "I've grown rather fond of having you around." He touched her cheek briefly, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just a week ago. Likewise. The attack began at twilight, that uncertain hour when shadows played tricks and men's eyes struggled to adjust. Jed had positioned his forces carefully, using the terrain to maximum advantage. The first shots came from the eastern ridge, Doc Morrison's group, firing into the horse lines, creating chaos as animals screamed and bolted. Colton's men scrambled for cover, shouting contradictions as they tried to locate the threat. Then Sheriff Briggs opened up from the west, his men's rifles cracking in disciplined volleys that spoke of the Army veterans among them. Jed waited, watching through his glasses as Colton tried to organize a defense. The outlaw leader was no fool. He quickly realized the attacks were meant to pin him down, that the real threat would come from elsewhere. "North!" Colton shouted. "Watch the north approach." But Jed wasn't coming from the north. He and Tom Mackenzie and the two ranch hands were already moving through the narrow defile that led into the bowl from the south, a passage so treacherous that Colton had posted only one guard, trusting to the difficult terrain. The guard never knew what hit him, Tom's lasso dropping over him and yanking him from his perch before he could cry out. They bound and gagged him, leaving him for later judgment. The camp was in full chaos now, men firing at shadows, unsure how many attackers they faced. Jed had learned long ago that in battle, confusion was often more powerful than bullets. He found a position overlooking Colton's tent and settled in to wait. It didn't take long. As full darkness fell and the gunfire continued sporadically, Colton emerged with Vasquez and two other men, heading for a protected spot among the rocks where they could assess the situation. Jed let them get comfortable, let them think they were safe. Then he put a bullet into the rock 6 inches from Colton's head. "Evening, Wade," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in a momentary lull. "Comfortable?" Colton spun, trying to locate him in the darkness. "Carter, should have known you'd be behind this." "Behind it, beside it, in front of it." Jed shifted position as he spoke, using the echoes off the canyon walls to confuse his location. "You're surrounded, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Your men are already wondering if you're worth dying for. You're bluffing. A handful of shopkeepers playing soldier." Another shot, this one from Tom Mackenzie, splintered the wooden crate Vasquez was sheltering behind. Then more shots from other positions, a coordinated volley that demonstrated their control of the high ground. "Does that sound like a handful to you?" Jed asked conversationally. "Face it, Colton, you miscalculated, thought we'd cower, thought we'd run. But you forgot something. This is our home, our land, and we're done letting scum like you ride through like you own it." The firefight intensified, muzzle flashes lighting the canyon like deadly fireflies. One of Colton's men tried to rush Doc Morrison's position and was cut down. Another broke cover, running for the horses, only to discover most of them gone, scattered by the initial attack. "Boss," one of Colton's men called out, "they're moving on the water." Indeed, Sheriff Briggs had led a contingent to seize control of the spring. Without water, in this heat, Colton's position would become untenable within hours. Jed heard Clara's rifle speak from somewhere behind him. She disobeyed orders and moved up. Her shot took the hat off a man trying to flank their position. Despite the danger, Jed felt a surge of pride. She'd become a fighter, this merchant's daughter. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Gradually, Colton's return fire slackened. Men were slipping away in the darkness, deciding that whatever Colton was paying wasn't worth their lives. The mighty gang was disintegrating. "Colton!" Jed called out again. "You've got one chance. Surrender now. Stand trial. Maybe you'll live to see prison. Keep fighting, and I guarantee you'll be buried in this canyon." "Go to hell, Carter!" But even as he shouted defiance, Colton was moving, trying to reach a narrow crack in the canyon wall that might offer escape. Jed had expected this. It's what he would have done. He was already in position when Colton emerged from the crack onto a ledge trail. They faced each other in the moonlight, 20 feet apart. Both men had their guns drawn but not yet aimed. "Should have left it alone," Colton said, his scarred face twisted with hate. "Should have minded your own business. Those women were my business the moment you left one to die on my land." Jed replied calmly. This was always going to end only one way. Colton's hand twitched. He was fast, faster than Jed expected. But Jed had learned long ago that in a gunfight, smooth was fast. And he'd been smooth death with a pistol since before Colton was robbing his first stage. 2 shots echoed off the canyon walls. So close together they sounded like one. Colton staggered, looking down at the spreading stain on his chest with something like surprise. His gun clattered on the rocks as he fell to his knees. "Funny thing," he wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. "All this over some women we'd have sold and forgotten. That's the difference between us," Jed said quietly. "I don't forget." Wade Colton pitched forward and was still. The death of their leader broke what remained of the gang's resistance. Vasquez tried to rally them but found himself shouting at empty air as men fled into the night. A few threw down their weapons and surrendered. By full dark, it was over. They gathered at the spring, taking stock. 2 townsmen wounded, neither seriously. Tom McKenzie had a graze on his arm he was rather proud of Colton's gang. 5 dead, including their leader. 6 captured. The rest scattered to the winds. Clara found Jed standing over Colton's body. She slipped her hand into his, saying nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Sheriff Briggs approached, looking older than his years, but satisfied. "It's done then. They'll sing songs about this in every saloon from here to El Paso. Let them sing about the town that stood together." Jed said, "Not about anyone, man." They made camp there that night, not trusting the darkness for travel with wounded. Clara tended injuries with supplies Doc Morrison had brought, her gentle efficiency bringing comfort to scared men who'd never expected to be in a real gunfight. As Jed stood watch, she brought him coffee, standing close in the cold desert air. "You did it," she said softly. "You stopped them." "We did it," he corrected. "All of us." "Even you, though I distinctly remember telling you to stay with the horses." She smiled, unrepentant. "I've never been good at following orders. Ask Margaret." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called, but the sound no longer seemed threatening. It was just the desert being itself, harsh but honest. "What happens now?" Clara asked eventually. "Now we go home," Jed said simply. "We build something worth protecting. We live." She leaned against him, her warmth a promise against the cold night. Together, together. When dawn broke over Skeleton Ridge, it illuminated a changed world. The shadow of the Colton gang no longer lay across the territory. The scattered outlaws would find no welcome in these parts, not with the story of their defeat spreading like wildfire. More importantly, a community had remembered its strength. Shopkeepers and ranchers, doctors and lawmen had stood together against a common threat and prevailed. It was a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. As they prepared to leave, Jed stood one last time where he'd faced Wade Colton. The body had been wrapped and loaded for transport to town, where it would be displayed as a warning to others of its ilk. But Jed wasn't thinking about Colton. He was thinking about the future, about the ranch that would no longer be a hiding place, but a home, about the woman whose courage had matched his own, about the life they'd build together. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the frontier, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The weeks following the battle at Skeleton Ridge passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. The ranch that had stood silent for so long now hummed with life and purpose. Clara had thrown herself into making the place a true home, while Margaret divided her time between helping with chores and filling journal after journal with her observations of frontier life. But beneath the bustle of daily routine, Jed could see the toll recent events had taken on both sisters. Clara would sometimes pause in her work, staring into the distance with haunted eyes. Margaret's sleep was often broken by nightmares that left her calling out for their father and brother. One evening, as purple shadows stretched across the land, Jed found Clara sitting alone by the creek, her arms wrapped around her knees like a child seeking comfort. He settled beside her without speaking, knowing she would talk when ready. "I killed a man," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "During the battle, he was trying to flank your position, and I didn't even think, just aimed and fired. You saved lives," Jed said gently. "Maybe mine. I know, logically. I know. But I keep seeing his face when he fell." She turned to look at him. "Does it get easier?" "No," he said honestly. "It shouldn't get easier. Taking a life should always weigh on a decent person. But you learn to carry the weight." She leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in silence as the first stars appeared. The creek gurgled softly, a peaceful sound that seemed at odds with their somber conversation. "Margaret's thinking of going back east," Clara said eventually. "She has an aunt in Boston who's offered to take her in, help her attend a ladies' college." Jed felt something tighten in his chest. "And you?" "She wants me to go with her. Says we could both use some time away from—" She gestured vaguely at the vast landscape. "All this. Maybe she's right." Clara sat up, studying his face in the gathering darkness. "Is that what you want? For me to go?" "I want what's best for you. If that means Boston." She placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. "I asked what you want. Jed Carter. Not what you think is best or proper or logical. What do you want?" He caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "I want you to stay. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. I want to build something lasting with you. But I won't ask you to give up your family, your chance at an easier life." This time, she silenced him with a kiss, soft and sure and full of promise. When they parted, she was smiling despite the tears on her cheeks. "My family is here now," she said simply. "This land, this life, it's hard and dangerous and sometimes heartbreaking, but it's also real and honest and ours. Boston has nothing I want that isn't right here." They walked back to the house hand in hand, finding Margaret on the porch, her latest journal in her lap. She looked up at their joined hands and smiled knowingly. "Finally," she said with exaggerated relief. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the barn until you sorted things out." "Margaret," Clara protested, but she was laughing. "So I suppose this means you won't be coming to Boston with me?" Margaret's tone was light, but Jed caught the wistfulness beneath. Clara sat beside her sister, taking her free hand. "You know I can't. This is where I belong now." "I know," Margaret said softly. "I've known since I saw you handle that rifle at Skeleton Ridge. You're not the same sister who left San Antonio. This place, these experiences, they've forged you into something stronger. We've both changed," Clara said, "and you'll change more in Boston. You'll become that writer you've dreamed of being." Margaret's smile turned mischievous. "Oh, I'm already a writer. I've been corresponding with a publisher in New York. They're very interested in my account of our ordeal and rescue. True Tales of Western Adventure, they're calling it. You haven't." Clara looked mortified. "Margaret, you can't publish our private—" "Oh, don't worry. I've changed names and details. Though I did keep Jed as a strong, silent rancher who saves the day. The ladies back east do love their frontier heroes." Jed groaned. "Just what I need. Fame." "Don't worry," Margaret assured him with false sympathy. "I made you very mysterious and brooding. You'll hate it." Despite himself, Jed found himself smiling. In just weeks, these two women had brought more laughter to his home than it had seen in 7 years. The next few days were bittersweet as they prepared for Margaret's departure. She would take the stage to Fort Worth, then the train east, a journey that would have terrified her before but now seemed like just another adventure. Tom Mackenzie offered to expand his home to accommodate the other rescued women who had nowhere to go, while the church in Clearwater organized support for those trying to reunite with distant family. Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had been killed in the initial attack, surprised everyone by announcing she would stay in Clearwater and open a boarding house. "I've seen the elephant," she said simply. "Might as well make the best of it." The night before Margaret's departure, they held a small gathering at the ranch. Tom brought his fiddle, and one of his hands had a guitar. Music filled the night air. Old songs of loss and hope, of lovers parted and reunited, of homes left behind and homes newly found. Clara and Jed danced on the hard-packed earth of the yard, her head on his shoulder, his arms strung around her. They moved slowly, regardless of the tempo, lost in their own world. "No regrets," he murmured against her hair. "None," she assured him. "Though you still owe me a proper wedding. Margaret's threatened to come back for it, and she'll bring half of Boston society if we're not careful. Small ceremony," he said firmly. "Just family and close friends." Agreed. Though in a town like Clearwater, that might still be half the population. They laughed quietly, the sound mixing with the music and the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of coyotes, all the sounds that made this harsh land home. The morning of departure came too soon. At the stage stop in Clearwater, Margaret embraced them both fiercely, tears streaming down her face despite her brave smile. "You take care of her," she told Jed sternly. "She's the only sister I've got." "With my life," he promised solemnly. Margaret turned to Clara, and for a moment, they were just two sisters facing another separation. They'd already lost so much: parents, brother, the life they'd known. But they'd found strength in that loss, and bonds that distance couldn't break. "Write me everything," Margaret demanded. "I want to know about the ranch, the horses, the weather, everything. And when you have children, I expect to be their favorite aunt who sends inappropriate gifts from Boston." "Margaret," Clara laughed through her tears, "we're not even married yet." "Details." Margaret waved dismissively. She climbed into the stage, then leaned out the window for one last look. "Be happy," she said simply. "Both of you. Be so happy it makes up for all the sorrow." Then the driver cracked his whip, and the stage rolled away in a cloud of dust, taking Margaret toward her own adventures. Clara watched until it disappeared, Jed's steady presence beside her an anchor against the loss. "She'll be fine," he said gently. "She's got your strength and then some." "I know." Clara wiped her eyes, then straightened her shoulders. "Come on, we've got a ranch to run." They rode home slowly, taking comfort in each other's company. The ranch, when it came into view, looked different somehow. Not the isolated fortress Jed had built, but a place of possibility. Over the following weeks, they settled into new rhythms. Clara proved to have a good head for numbers, taking over the ranch accounts and finding ways to economize that Jed had never considered. She also had a gentler hand with the horses, especially the young ones, and soon had them following her around like puppies. Jed taught her to shoot better, to read the weather in cloud formations and wind patterns, to understand the subtle signals that meant the difference between safety and danger in this unforgiving land. In return, she taught him to see beauty he'd stopped noticing, the way morning light turned the grassland to gold, the delicate flowers that bloomed after rain, the grace in a hawk's hunting spiral. They worked side by side through blazing heat and bitter cold, through calving season and roundup, through all the countless tasks that make up a rancher's life. And in the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes just being comfortable in a silence that spoke louder than words. The community, too, was healing. The shared danger had forged bonds that wouldn't easily break. When the Hendersons' barn burned, everyone turned out to rebuild it. When drought threatened, ranchers shared water rights that they'd have fought over before. Sheriff Briggs, emboldened by their success, actually started enforcing laws he'd previously been too intimidated to touch. One evening, as summer gave way to autumn, Jed found Clara standing by the window, a letter from Margaret in her hand. She was smiling, but tears tracked down her cheeks. "Good news?" he asked, concerned. "The best," she said, showing him the letter. "A publisher has agreed to publish her book. She's going to be a real author, just like she dreamed." "That's wonderful." She also says she's met someone, a young professor at the college, very serious and proper, which apparently makes it even more fun to shock him with tales of her Western adventures. Clara laughed. "She sounds happy, really truly happy." "Good, she deserves it." He pulled Clara close. "You both do." They stood together, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The land stretched out before them, vast and challenging and full of promise. "I never thanked you," Clara said softly. "For what?" "For opening that sack, for giving me a chance when it would have been easier to ride away, for showing me that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances." "You saved me too," Jed said simply. "I was dead inside, going through motions, existing but not living. You brought me back to life." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "Then we're even." "Not quite," he said, and dropped to one knee, pulling out a simple gold ring he'd been carrying for days, waiting for the right moment. "Clara Bennett, will you—" "Yes," she interrupted, laughing and crying at once. "Yes to everything. Yes to this life, this land, this love. Yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, then stood and kissed her as the last light faded from the sky. In the distance, coyotes began their evening chorus, and nightbirds called from the creek. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain. They were home. As they walked back to the house, their house, hand in hand, Clara paused to look back at the vast landscape that had become her world. "Do you think they're watching?" she asked softly. "Our families. Do you think they know we found each other?" Jed followed her gaze to where the first stars were appearing. "I think they know," he said quietly. "And I think they're at peace, knowing we're not alone anymore." They went inside together, closing the door on the night, on the past, on all the sorrow that had brought them to this moment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would always be challenges in this hard land. But they would face them together. Two souls who had found their forever in the most unlikely of places. The lonely rancher was lonely no more, and in the vast tapestry of Western stories, theirs would be remembered not for its sorrow, but for its joy, proof that even in the harshest ground, love could take root and bloom. The autumn morning dawned crisp and golden, with that particular quality of light that only comes to the high desert in October. Clara stood in what she'd transformed into a proper kitchen garden, gathering the last of the tomatoes before frost claimed them. The ranch had changed in the months since she'd arrived, small touches of civilization softening its harsh edges without compromising its essential character. "Letter from Margaret," Jed called from the porch, waving the envelope that had come with Tom Mackenzie's supply run. Clara hurried inside, wiping her hands on her apron, another domestic touch that would have seemed impossible in those first desperate days. She took the letter eagerly, always hungry for news from her sister. As she read, her expression shifted from joy to concern. "She's coming for a visit," Clara said slowly. "With her professor." "That's good news, isn't it?" Jed poured coffee, a morning ritual they'd developed. "Yes, but—" Clara worried her lip, a gesture he'd come to recognize. "She says Professor Whitman has proposed. She wants our blessing before she accepts." "Our blessing?" Jed raised an eyebrow. "She needs permission to be happy?" "Not permission, approval. There's a difference." Clara set down the letter. "We're all the family she has left. She wants to know we think she's making the right choice." Jed considered this. In the month since taking Clara as his wife, in a simple ceremony officiated by Clearwater's circuit preacher, he'd come to understand the deep bonds between the sisters. Their shared tragedy had forged something unbreakable, a connection that distance couldn't diminish. When will they arrive? 2 weeks. Oh, Jed, the house isn't ready for guests, especially not a Boston professor who probably expects proper amenities, and he silenced her spiral of worry with a kiss. The house is fine. We're fine. Margaret doesn't care about amenities. And if this professor does, then he's not worthy of her. Clara relaxed into his embrace. You're right. Of course you're right. It's just, I want her to see that I'm happy, that this life, as different as it is from what we planned, is good. She'll see, Jed assured her. How could she not? The next 2 weeks flew by in a whirlwind of preparation. Clara insisted on new curtains for the spare room, and Jed found himself whitewashing the fence, a chore he'd neglected for years. Even Tom Mackenzie got caught up in the excitement, offering to lend his good china for the visit. Haven't seen the boy this worked up since his wedding, Tom confided to his wife, chuckling at Jed's sudden interest in appearances. The day of arrival came with unseasonable warmth, the kind of false summer that sometimes blessed the territory before winter set in earnest. Jed and Clara waited at the stage stop, her hand tight in his. What if he's awful? Clara whispered. What if he's condescending about the West, or treats Margaret like she's some curiosity? Then we'll feed him to the coyotes, Jed said mildly, earning a shocked laugh. The stage rolled in with its usual cloud of dust and drama. Margaret emerged first, and Clara gasped. Her little sister had transformed. Gone was the frightened girl from the rescue, replaced by a young woman of poise and confidence. She wore a traveling suit of deep blue that complemented her coloring, and her eyes sparkled with happiness. Clara! Margaret flew into her sister's arms, and for a moment they were just two girls again, clinging to each other. A man descended from the stage, tall, thin, with spectacles and the pallor of someone who spent his days in libraries. But his smile was warm as he watched the sisters' reunion, and when Margaret turned to introduce him, he stepped forward without hesitation. Professor Andrew Whitman, he said, offering his hand to Jed. I've heard so much about you. Mr. Carter, Margaret's stories of your heroism. Just Jed, he interrupted, shaking the man's hand and finding a surprisingly firm grip. And I suspect Margaret's stories grew in the telling. Oh, undoubtedly. Andrew agreed with a self-deprecating laugh. She does have a gift for narrative embellishment. It's what makes her such a promising writer. The ice broke with that admission of Margaret's tendency toward drama. And by the time they reached the ranch, conversation flowed easily. Andrew proved to be genuinely interested in ranch operations, asking intelligent questions about water rights and grazing patterns. I study history, he explained as Jed showed him around. The transformation of the frontier is one of the great stories of our time. To see it firsthand, to understand the reality behind the mythology, it's a privilege. That evening, as they sat down to Clara's carefully prepared meal, Margaret regaled them with tales of Boston society's reaction to her Western adventures. You should see their faces when I tell them about the gunfight, she said, eyes dancing with mischief, proper Beacon Hill ladies nearly fainting into their tea. Margaret, you don't, Clara protested. Oh, but I do. How else will they understand? The West isn't just cowboys and Indians. The way dime novels paint it, it's people like us, trying to build something in a hard land. She reached for Andrew's hand. It's why I wanted Andrew to see it for himself, to understand where I come from, what shaped me. And what do you think? Clara asked Andrew directly. Does our frontier life meet your expectations? Andrew considered carefully. It exceeds them, he said finally. I expected hardship and isolation. What I didn't expect was the sense of community, the way people here take care of each other. In Boston, you can live next door to someone for years and never know their name. Here, your nearest neighbor might be miles away, but they'll ride through a storm if you need help. Speaking of community, Margaret interjected, Wait until you hear about the town's reaction to my book. She produced a slim volume from her traveling bag. Western Winds, A True Account of Courage on the Frontier, by M. L. Bennett. M. L.? Clara questioned. Margaret Louise. The publisher thought initials sounded more serious. She opened to the dedication page and read, "To my sister Clara, whose courage taught me strength, and to Jed Carter, who proved that heroes still walk among us." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Margaret, it's selling quite well," Andrew added proudly. "There's talk of a lecture tour, which brings us to our news." Margaret said, suddenly serious. She looked between Clara and Jed. "Andrew has asked me to marry him, but I needed you to meet him first, to know that you approve." Clara studied the couple, her sister vibrant with happiness, the quiet professor who looked at Margaret like she hung the moon. "Do you love him?" she asked simply. "With all my heart." "And you?" Clara turned to Andrew. "Do you understand what you're getting with Margaret? She's not some delicate Eastern flower. She's survived things that would break most people. She's strong and opinionated and magnificent," Andrew finished. "I fell in love with her strength first, her story second, and her spirit most of all. I don't want to tame the West out of her. I want to spend my life watching her conquer new worlds." Jed spoke for the first time. "Then you have our blessing. But know this, Margaret is our family. Hurt her, and you'll answer to us." Andrew met his gaze steadily. "I would expect nothing less." Margaret launched herself at them, tears streaming. "I knew you'd understand. Oh, Clara, we can have a double wedding ceremony when we renew your vows. I'll bring my publisher. He's dying to meet the real Jed Carter." "Absolutely not," Jed said firmly, but he was smiling. The visit lasted a week, filled with long rides showing Andrew the territory, evening conversations about everything from literature to livestock, and the kind of laughter that comes from new family finding its rhythm. Andrew proved surprisingly adaptable, even helping with chores despite his obvious inexperience. "He's never held a branding iron in his life," Jed told Clara after watching the professor's clumsy attempts to help with the calves. "No, but he's trying. That matters." She leaned against the corral fence, watching Margaret teach Andrew to rope. "She's happy. So are you." It wasn't a question. The Clara who'd emerged from that burlap sack, broken and desperate, had transformed into a woman of quiet strength and deep joy. She'd found her place in this harsh land, made it bloom with her presence. On their last evening, they sat on the porch watching another spectacular sunset. Margaret had her journal out, sketching the scene in words, while Andrew read beside her. It was a peaceful tableau that spoke of futures unfolding. "I'll be back for Christmas," Margaret announced. "And I expect a proper tree and presents and everything." "In the middle of the desert?" Clara laughed. "Details." Margaret waved dismissively. "We'll make our own traditions." As the stage prepared to leave the next morning, the sisters clung to each other again. "Be happy," Clara whispered, echoing Margaret's words from months ago. "I am. We both are." Margaret pulled back, smiling through tears. Who would have thought that terrible day would lead to this? 2 sisters, 2 loves, 2 lives we never expected but wouldn't trade for anything. They watched the stage disappear into the distance, then rode home slowly, savoring the quiet companionship. The ranch welcomed them back, familiar now as breathing. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Clara found Jed standing by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Regrets?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Never." He turned to embrace her properly. "I was just thinking about chances. The chance that brought you to my land. The chance I took opening that sack. All the choices that led us here. Divine providence. My mother would have called it. Maybe. Or maybe we make our own providence by choosing hope over fear." He kissed her forehead. "Either way, I'm grateful." They stood together in the quiet house, not empty now but full of possibility, of dreams taking root in unlikely soil. Outside, the desert wind sang its ancient song, and somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to their mates. "Margaret asked me to write a piece for her next book," Clara said, "about building a life out here, about finding love after loss. Will you?" "I think so. People should know it's not all gunfights and drama. Sometimes the real adventure is in the quiet moments, learning to read the weather, bringing in a good harvest, sitting with someone you love while the world turns toward darkness, knowing you're exactly where you belong." Jed smiled, pulling her closer. "That doesn't sound quiet to me. That sounds like the greatest adventure of all." And it was. In the vast story of the American West, among all the tales of outlaws and lawmen, settlers and soldiers, theirs was a simple one. Two people who found each other in the most unlikely way, who built something lasting from sorrow and hope, who proved that sometimes the best endings are actually beginnings. The lonely rancher had opened a sack and found his forever, and in finding it, he'd given Clara hers as well. Together, they faced the future, uncertain as all futures are, but rich with promise, strong with love, and bright with the kind of hope that turns the harshest desert into a garden. As night settled over the ranch and they prepared for sleep, secure in each other's arms, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and somewhere in that vast tapestry of light, their story took its place. One more gleaming thread in the endless narrative of courage, love, and redemption that was the American frontier. The end of their beginning had come. The beginning of their forever stretched ahead, as wide and wonderful as the western sky. "Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through Please Help Me," she cried. The lonely rancher opened the sack and found his forever. "We hope this tale of love, courage, and redemption in the Old West has touched your heart as much as it touched ours. We'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments below where you're listening to this story from, whether you're driving through the countryside, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere in the American West itself. Your thoughts and feedback mean the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic Western stories that capture the spirit of frontier life. Share your thoughts about Clara and Jed's journey, and let us know what kind of Western tales you'd like to hear next. Until we meet again on the trail, partners, keep riding toward your own horizons.